You're listening to KEPW LP 97.3 FM, serving Eugene and Springfield. Also live streaming at www.kepw.org. Welcome to the Age of Vision radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark, where we constantly remind you that love is greater than fear and happiness is resistance. Thank you for joining me again tonight. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Vision radio show. I want to say hi to all of our fans out there in Eugene and Springfield. We really appreciate you listening to our show. Our showtime has moved. We are now on Wednesday and Thursday night at 11 p.m. So you can catch us at 11 o'clock on Thursday evening and Wednesday evening. You can go to my podcast on Spreaker and look for the Age of Vision radio show and listen to the entire podcast there. I'm also on YouTube under Nuts for Art, NUTZFORART, which, because I'm nuts for art, that's why. Anyways, I want to thank you. I want to get to this reading. There is some nuclear news this week. Some things are really happening, and I don't want to take away our time from reading, but I was in a quandary. Which one should I read about? There is actually a public meeting being held. It'll be too late for people to go to here in the Northwest. It came out from the Columbia River Keepers. They want to tell you about their proposal for Hanford. They're meeting with the Department of Energy. There's going to be a public meeting with the Yakima Nation and the Hanford Cleanup Advocacy Group. They're going explanation of the Department of Energy's proposal to reclassify Hanford waste. It's going to be 6:30 p.m. on Monday. That's this Monday that this is playing at 11 o'clock at night, so you won't be able to go to it. But you should know about it. It's at the Vancouver Community Library in Columbia Room, 901C in Vancouver. Please contact the Columbia River Keepers, and you can go to them online and find out what their schedule is. They often put things out sort of last minute because they hear about things last minute. So I want to read this because this is urgent. There is still public comment open for quite a long time on this idea, so it is not untimely. Although the Hanford Nuclear Reservation is more than 200 miles upriver from Vancouver, the environmental group Columbia Riverkeeper wants Clark County residents to understand the potential ramifications of the U.S. Department of Energy's proposal to reclassify radioactive waste at the shuttered nuclear production site. Energy is taking steps to change how the federal government labels the nuclear waste left inside Hanford storage tanks. By reclassifying high-level nuclear waste, which has to be removed, to low-level nuclear waste, the material would be allowed to be left in place and the storage tanks filled with concrete, then sealed up with a cap. The tanks lie close to the Columbia River. In a report titled Draft Waste Incidental to Reprocessing Evaluation for Closure at Waste Management Area C at the Hanford site, Washington, the Energy Department concludes that the site's radioactive waste has been remediated to a satisfactory degree and that the remaining waste, if properly stored, could be treated as low-level radioactive waste. You get that? It's not low-level radioactive waste, but they think there's not enough of it to treat it like low-level radioactive waste. It's not that much, so we'll just leave it in place. In quotes. This is one of the biggest policy decisions in recent years at Hanford, said Dan Series, Riverkeeper's Conservation Director. It will impact people throughout the entire region. By reclassifying waste at Hanford, the Department of Energy is setting the stage to leave highly radioactive waste in the tanks and in the soil beneath the tanks. The environmental organization, along with the speakers of the Yakima Nation and Hanford Cleanup Advocacy Groups, Hanford Challenge, and the Heart of America Northwest, plan to give an in-depth explanation of Energy's proposal and the current progress of the site's cleanup during a public meeting at 6:30 p.m. on Monday at the Vancouver Community Library Columbia Room, 901C, Vancouver. I apologize you could not hear this sooner. The meeting comes just days after the government after the federal government extended the public comment period on the proposal to November 7. So make sure you do make your public comments because they matter. The proposal is similar to the one Energy made in the early 2000s that faced sharp criticism from environmental groups and politicians. We want people to get up to speed on the issue enough so that they can contact the decision makers on this issue and encourage people to engage with them and understand Washington state and federal delegations have an important voice in this issue, said Ceres. So that is just a really quick one on. I will get back to our reading, but this is one of the things I love about KEPW. My broadcast is on Spreaker, and I am on all of those venues that it allows. iHeartRadio, YouTube. But KEPW is an FM nonprofit, community-focused organization, unlike all the rest of the nonprofit 501(c) organizations. They all chase the big money, and they all do not let these types of programs on the air. KEPW is a 2-year-old station, guys. It's an FM radio station, which Eugene Peaceworks could have turned it into a profit network, but they didn't. They turned it into a nonprofit network, where we have community-based, serving the voice of the underserved. The people that you cannot hear anywhere else are on KEPW. So I'm taking up part of this time to really, anybody who's listening to my voice, who goes to www.kepw.org, sign up as a sustaining member. $5 a month matters a lot to a little tiny fledgling station. So I'm just encouraging people who are interested in this to support the little tiny stations that matter, that keep this voice out. I myself on Spreaker am completely unpaid. I don't have corporate sponsors. I reach out to activists and people who have been affected by nuclear. I reach out to healers. We bring a lot of different voices to the table that just are not listened to. Not that people don't want to listen to them. They can't get on the air because people don't want to hear it. So, one of the reasons why my radio show is on at 11 o'clock at night on KEPW is because there's a sense that this is kind of heavy material and you don't want it at the dinner hour, you don't want it in the middle of the day. Frankly, I said yes to whatever hour they could arrange it at, but I do know people that when I was on at 6 o'clock told me they listened and they loved it. So I don't think that this is a topic that people are not interested in. So I'm just sharing my opinion, frankly, which I'm entitled to do here. Since it's my podcast. It's actually your podcast. I'm doing this for the listeners. My goal is to get millions of people up to speed. I am going to continue reading this book by Karl Grossman, and I know several of our listeners are really, really listening for it this week. But I wanted to take up my part of the hour on this story in Hanford because they are talking about reclassifying highly contaminated radioactive waste and just leaving it at Hanford, folks. That can't happen. It needs all of us. Anybody who listens to this show needs to go to the Riverkeepers, the Columbia Riverkeepers website. So anyways, I am going to get to our reading. We left off on page 48 on the new subtopic called Politics, Puppeteering, and the Power Structure. And this book is by Karl Grossman. And I think we have about 35 minutes to go, so here we go. What I'll do is I think I'll start the whole paragraph. I'll read the previous paragraph, which is the very first paragraph from this subtitle. We're on page 48, Weapons in Space, by Karl Grossman, written in 2002. Can you believe it? Or 1. It's 2001, I beg your pardon. And Karl Grossman has given me permission to read this book. Politics, Puppeteering, and the Power Structure. By 2000, the Star Wars plans, with some changes, Teller's hydrogen bomb Excalibur scheme was ultimately dropped as being wholly impractical, was still alive. The heart of Ronald Reagan's 1983 Star Wars program lives on, kept beating by a mix of election year politicking, behind-the-scenes defense industry puppeteering, and a fiercely committed group of conservative think tanks and anti-missile advocates, Time magazine reported in a 2000 article on missile defense. Those working to make sure Star Wars kept beating, including the Republican right, aerospace corporations that have spent huge amounts of money in lobbying the political system, arch-conservative foundations like the Heritage Foundation and the U.S. military, especially its U.S. Space Command. Not surprisingly, noted Time, in the Reagan-era Star Wars program lives on, and, quote, defense contractors have a major interest in the national missile defense system, especially since its ultimate cost is estimated to be more than $30 billion. The four largest weapons contractors, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and TRW, together received more than $2.2 billion in missile defense research and development money over the recent 21-month era span, according to a report issued by the World Policy Institute. In 1997 and 98, the latest years for which figures are available, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, TRW spent $35 million on lobbying. On the Republican right, which I call them the Republican wrong, no politician has been more attractive in recent times to keeping Star Wars alive than Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire. Control of space is more than a new mission area. It is our moral legacy, our next manifest destiny, our chance to secure security for centuries to come, Smith told the Aerospace Industry Association in 2000. With the technology that we already have developed and demonstrated, we have the opportunity today to move forward, he stressed, on the program that President Reagan envisioned almost 20 years ago, more than the marginal defense this administration has been struggling with for the past few months. Space is absolutely critical to figure war fighting. Wow. This increasing importance was demonstrated in the Gulf War and the Balkans. I firmly believe that whoever controls space will win the next war. He advocated a broad program of including weapons in space and attainment by the U.S. of global dominance. Smith, a member of the Senate Armed Service Committee, has been the leader in Congress in creating a separate U.S. Space Force from the U.S. Air Force. A Space Force will put the next muscle behind space missions that the Army, Navy, and Air Force flex in their missions, he said. He authored an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2000 that established a 13-member commission chaired by Don Rumsfeld to look into how the U.S. Space Force would operate. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I read the word Don Rumsfeld, I see thorns and devil and hideousness. What an evil man. Let's get back to Karl's book. But so-called centrist political elements in the U.S., including many elected Democrats, have been more than just going along. The massive amounts of money dispensed by the aerospace corporations has been one factor. But there is more. Through the years, a good number of Democratic officials have backed a program of space warfare, even during the late 1980s when many Americans were refusing to accept the Reagan Star Wars scheme, and through the Clinton administration of the 1990s. The Democratic Party has shown over and over again it is in consonance with the plans for space warfare and global domination, says Bruce Gagnon of Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. In Congress, they've supported in strong numbers the expenditures. Moreover, with NASA and U.S. corporate interests seeking to mine the moon, Mars, and other planets, along with steroids. Mars and other planets, along with asteroids, you see a conjunction of interests. It is not just right-wing kooks and the military promoting Star Wars, declares Gagnon. It's what we can call the power structure. Strong evidence can be found in the book Military Space Forces, the next 50 years, that stresses on its title page that it was, quote, commissioned by Congress, unquote. A Democratic-controlled U.S. Congress in the mid-1980s. This blueprint for space warfare is as wild and extreme as anything produced by the U.S. Space Command or the Heritage Foundation, and yet was endorsed personally by a group of mostly Democrats and commissioned by the Democratic Congress. The list of officials signing off on the congressional introduction is topped by the facsimile signatures of Representative Ike Skelton of Missouri, John Spratt of South Carolina, Democrats and leaders in recent years for missile defense. And both those guys are gone right now. But, they leave their legacy of pro-nuke. Then there are the signatures of then Senator John Glenn of Ohio, the ex-astronaut and a Democrat, given a NASA space shuttle ride in 1999. Now U.S. Senator, then Representative Bill Nelson, Florida Democrat representing Cape Canaveral and the rest of Space Coast, who got his NASA space shuttle ride in 1986, and Representative Harold Volkmar of a Missouri Democrat. And of those people, only Bill Nelson is around still. The two Republicans are Representative John Kasich, who is going to probably run for president again, and Ben Blas, a non-voting member of the House from Guam. Wow. I don't know about you guys, but when I hear these things, I start spitting nails. At what point do the Democrats say they do not believe in nuclear weapons? This is outrageous. Let me get back to this book. The congressional introduction declares that Congress asked John M. Mills, senior specialist in national defense at the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress, in June 1987, to prepare a frame of reference that could help Congress evaluate future as well as present military space policies, programs, and budgets. After a foreword by General John L. Pietrowski, then Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Space Command, Military Space Forces, and that's in italics, like that's the title of it. It's called Military Space Forces. Opens with the consideration of economic and military enterprises on the moon. Quote, the moon is rich in many natural resources. Iron, titanium, aluminum, manganese, and calcium are abundant. Simple machines could easily strip top layers, unquote. Wow. Military bases on the moon are not only, quote, I'm going to start again. Listen to this. Oh my gosh. What is our nation about? This is so unbelievable. Military bases on the moon would not only defend the mining operations, but could take advantage of what Military Space Forces calls the, quote, gravity well of Earth. This is described as a channel in space between the moon and Earth. Military space forces at the bottom of Earth's so-called gravity well are poorly positioned to accomplish offensive, defensive, deterrent missions because great energy is needed to overcome gravity during launch, it says. But forces at the top, on the moon, could act more rapidly. Put simply, it takes less energy to drop objects down a well than to cast them out. Forces at the top also enjoy more maneuvering room and greater reaction time. A map of the best site on the moon from which the U.S. could take military advantage of this gravity well is provided, and the work stresses that U.S. armed forces might lie in wait at that location to hijack rival shipments of materials mined by other nations. The U.S. according to this congressionally authored plan, would engage in piracy in space. Combat on the moon is discussed with observation. Lunar foxholes would provide better cover than terrestrial counterparts because the absence of air confines blast effects to much smaller areas. Military Space Forces, that's the title, remember this, Military Space Forces, that's the title of the report produced by Congress. This is the title. I'm spitting nails, can you just tell, folks? I can barely read this. Military Space Forces examines space weapons and states that nuclear weapons have a drawback. Nuclear weapons detonated in the atmosphere create shock waves, violent winds, and intense heat that can inflict severe damage and casualties well beyond the hypocenter. But in space, wind never blows in a vacuum, shock waves cannot develop, and neither fireballs nor superheated surrounding air develop above about 65 miles. Consequently, it would take direct hits or near misses to achieve required results with nuclear blast and thermal radiation. On the other hand, space is a nearly perfect laser environment because light promulgates unimpeded in a vacuum, it says. Laser weapons, regardless of type, gas, chemical, excimer, free electron, solid state, X-ray, concentrate a tightly focused shaft or pulse of radiant energy photons on a target surface, Military Space Forces explains. The beam burns through. The book also examines the use of chemical and biological warfare in space and states. Self-contained biospheres in space accord a superlative environment for chemical and biological warfare. Gosh, that's a hard word for me to say, warfare. Good thing, I'm glad it doesn't roll off my tongue that easy. Clandestine operatives could dispense lethal or incapacitating CW or BW agents rapidly and uniformly through enemy facilities. And in case you're wondering what CW means, conventional weapons would have their place too, it says, pointing out that high-speed birdshot could seriously damage most space facilities which are strong enough to maintain structural integrity and repel micrometeoroids, but not much more. BW or biological weapons, folks. As to the UN Charter seeking... Well, let me go back. Hold on. Military Space Forces. Was that the name of it? Maybe I am wrong. Yeah. Oh, no. I was wrong. Stresses its title page. Yes, it is. Strong evidence can be found in the book Military Space Forces, the Next 50 Years, that stresses on its title page that it was commissioned by Congress. So I was not incorrect. As I was reading this, it acts like it's a book. I guess Congress commissioned a book to be written. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm writing a book like this, a lot of times I have to go back to get my brain clear. So I hope you don't mind. I'm not going to edit this all out, but I think that it's important for us to talk about these books as we're reading them. As to the UN Charter seeking peaceful and friendly international relations, the Outer Space Treaty designating space as a place for exploration and other endeavors shall be carried out for the benefit of all mankind, and the Moon Agreement of 1979 saying that neither the surface nor the subsurface of the moon or other celestial bodies within the solar system shall become the property of any person or state, Military Space Forces declares. The strength of such convictions will be tested upon economic competition quickens in space. Well, this doesn't make sense because in that same book they're saying that the United States could lie in wait and engage in piracy in space. So what the heck are they talking about? The strength of such convictions will be tested when economic competition quickens in space. I guess this is why we got Trader Trump, because the Democrats, they just talk out of both sides of their mouth. Parties that hope to satisfy economic interests in space must maintain ready access to resources on the moon and beyond, despite opposition if necessary, and perhaps deny access to its competitors, it says. A good way to keep other nations from engaging in space militarily, it goes on, is to control attitudes in other countries. Control over elitist and popular opinion using inexpensive psychological operations as a non-lethal weapon system could convince rivals that it would be useless to start or continue space military programs, it says. The basic objective would be to deprive opponents from freedom of action while preserving it for oneself. Senior national executives, legislators, members of the mass media, and through them, the body politic, would be the typical targets. That's me and you, folks. That's the targeting. Wow. This is amazing. Meanwhile, for the U.S., superiority in space could culminate in a bloodless total victory if lagging powers could neither cope nor catch up technology. Oops, too late. As examples of the advantages of waging war from space, Collins states that naval surface ships comprise a particularly inviting target category. Former astronaut Michael Collins, who has been there and back twice, believes space is an ideal place from which to attack aircraft carriers and other major surface combatants. And, quote, strike forces on the moon could choose from a full range of offensive maneuvers, unquote. I don't know why this is funny to me, but it seems like a sick joke, but it's not, folks. That's why I'm reading it. This is the reality. Military Space Forces also urges the use of nuclear power in space. Both plutonium-fueled radioisotope thermoelectric generators and nuclear reactors, which are the only known long-lived compact source able to supply military space forces with electric power about 10 kilowatts and megawatts. Cores no bigger than basketballs are able to produce 100 kilowatts, enough for housekeeping aboard space stations and at lunar outlets. Large versions could meet megawatt needs in space-based lasers, neutral particle beams, mass drivers in railguns, unquote. Among the endorsements featured on the back cover of Military Space Forces are from Senator Sam Nunn, a Georgia Democrat and the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, that, quote, this book will be an indispensable starting point, and then Representative Les Aspin, a Wisconsin Democrat, later a Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, stating, no other military space study puts all the pieces of the puzzle together, unquote. General John W. Vesley, Jr., former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, states, military space forces should be useful for decades. Now we've come to a new subtitle called Internal Opposition. I'm going to keep going. There are Democrats, of course, emphatically against the U.S. weaponization of space in the United States. One has been former U.S. Senator Charles Robb of Virginia, defeated for re-election in 2000, who declared in 1999, the United States and other nations have rightly avoided placing weapons in space. A space-based arms race would be essentially irreversible. It defies reason to assume that nations would sit idle while the United States invests billions of dollars in weaponizing space, leaving them at unprecedented advantage. Once this genie is out of the bottle, there's no way to put it back in. We could never afford to bring all these systems back to Earth, and destroying them would be equally unfeasible, because the billions of pieces of space debris would jeopardize commercial satellites and manned missions. Moreover, said Robb, himself a former military officer, if space becomes a war zone, quote, the fog of war would reach an entirely new density, unquote. And in the House of Representatives, leading opponents of the Star Wars include Cynthia McKinney of Georgia, Lynn Woolsey of California, and Dennis Kucinich of Ohio. You're listening to KEPW LP 97.3 FM, serving Eugene and Springfield. Also live streaming at www.kepw.org. Leave Star Wars to the movies, declared McKinney on the House floor April 11, 2000, as the three made an effort to stop the missile defense program. She spoke about the tens of billions of dollars that would have been squandered on Star Wars. Now they have changed the name to the National Missile Defense, but it is the same thing. The U.S. Space Command calls for expanded war-fighting capabilities in outer space. The guiding words in this country, said Kucinich, ought to be, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," not "war be done in heaven as it is on earth." Let us work for peace on earth, not war in space. Later that week, Kucinich gave the keynote address at the 2000 International Meeting of the Global Network Against at the 2000 International Meeting of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. We know that moving forward with a national missile defense system will set the stage for the advancement and proliferation of the nuclear weapons in space, he declared. And we know that once we continue down this road, we're going to be locked into funding an industry that makes missiles and anti-missiles and creates policies to promote the use of missiles and more spending on missiles. He asked what happened to the Cold War benefit. There's only a restless, ceaseless arms race which rides the newest technological wave to continue to drain our national resources, to continue to create fear in Americans, to continue to create fear abroad, to continue to make the world less safe, and to continue to drive our national consciousness downward. You got that right, Mr. Kucinich. That's exactly where we're at. We're about as low as we can get in this country right now, 2018. Back to Mr. Grossman's book, enough from the peanut gallery. Kucinich spoke of the opposition of the U.S. in the UN to the resolution seeking to prevent an arms race in outer space by reaffirming the Outer Space Treaty. It's my belief that the United States must sign on and send a message to the world that space is for peace, not war. Unfortunately, there are policymakers who are aimed at having the country make a statement totally the opposite. He dismissed the claim by advocates of the missile defense system that the system is not Star Wars all over again. It's ground wars. Let's name names, he went on. Lockheed Martin, TRW, Boeing, they now have a contract to build the space-based laser weapons that will be the follow-on technology to ballistic missile defense. This weapon systems will enable the U.S. to have the offensive capability in space as called for by, and he held up, Vision for 2020. It seems that Orwell's vision of 1984 just follows the curve of time, and it's taken us into 2020, where the vision of the United States Space Command is for war in space, said Kucinich, because what this states is that the U.S. Space Command intends to control and dominate space, seize the heavens, the high ground, unquote. We are creating the seeds of the destruction of people all over the world, and it inevitably will come back to this country as well, he said to Applause. I think that we have a wonderful country. I'm proud to be a member of the United States Congress serving our country, said Kucinich. But if we love our country, then if we see our country taking a path that is dangerous, that we must help our country by challenging our country to do the right thing and not the wrong thing, he said, to more applause. We have to address this as a moral issue as well, he said, because it is a moral issue. We're a country that should be about turning swords into plowshares, not in fashioning new, technologically superior swords of Damocles over the population of the world. We cannot serve as a nation with that approach. We cannot survive as a nation with that approach. I think I should read that again. We have to address this as a moral issue as well, he said, because it is a moral issue. We're a country that should be about turning swords into plowshares, not into fashioning new, technologically superior swords of Damocles over the populations of the world. We cannot survive as a nation with that approach. In the 1980s, too, there were members of Congress, not that many, who were vigorously challenging Star Wars. Some, such as Barney Frank, a Massachusetts Democrat, are still there, no longer there, folks. They introduced resolutions in 1983 and 84 calling for international negotiations for a ban on weapons of any kind in space. Neither bill came even close to passing. And in recent votes for missile defense, the numbers have been lopsided for deployment of missile defense even after tests of the systems have failed. Figures. Now, with the Cheney-Bush takeover, the U.S. Now, can you imagine? We've gone past the Cheney-Bush takeover. We're in la-la land with Trader Trump. He completely disregards all aspects of the law. Now, with the Bush-Cheney takeover, the U.S. has an administration highly enthusiastic, gung-ho for Star Wars. Bush said during the presidential campaign that he would deploy missile defense as soon as possible. His administration would develop a new architecture of American defense for decades to come. Wrote Washington Post reporter Walter Pincus, his concept, which has encountered broad support among congressional Republicans, appear to be nearly identical to the missile shield proposed by his father. Bush has a grandiose scheme for the real all-out Star Wars scenario, as the Washington Post columnist Mary McRory described it. The Bush-Cheney team is loaded with links to the corporations most deeply involved in U.S. plans for waging war in space. Indeed, Cheney is a former member of the board of TRW. His wife, Lynn Cheney, recently left the board of Lockheed Martin. I wrote the Republican Party's foreign policy platform, Bruce Jackson, vice president of the corporate strategy and development of Lockheed Martin, proudly told me in an interview. Jackson said that he was selected to be the overall chairman of the Foreign Policy Platform Committee at the Republican National Convention, at which he was a delegate. Thus, the Bush administration will be using a foreign policy platform admittedly written by a top executive of Lockheed Martin to the world's biggest weapons manufacturer and central to U.S. space warfare preparations. Jackson said that during the campaign he did not lead the advocacy for full development of missile defense because, considering Lockheed Martin's heavy involvement, that would be an implicit conflict of interest with my day job. Instead, this was done by Stephen J. Hadley. Hadley, an assistant secretary for Defense of International Security Policy of the administration of Bush's father, is the partner in the Washington firm of Shea and Gardner, which represents Lockheed Martin. Yeah, they're not even trying to thinly veil it, are they? Hadley is a member, said Jackson, of the Vulcans. This is the name given in the Bush campaign to an 8-member group which during the campaign advised Bush on foreign policy and also includes Condoleezza Rice, appointed National Security Council Director. Jackson and Hadley have also worked closely with an entity called the Committee to Expand NATO. Jackson is president of this entity, based in the Washington office of the right-wing American Enterprise Institute, and Hadley is its secretary. Hadley was also a member of the National Security Council staff during the earlier Bush administration. He has appointed Deputy Director of the National Security Council in the new Bush administration. Quote, "Space is going to be important. It has a great future in the military," Hadley said, speaking as an advisor to Bush, told the Air Force Association in an address at the National Convention September 11, 2000, so a year before they planned the attack on our country, those rats. He stated the Bush's concern had been that the Clinton administration's proposal does not do the job right and it doesn't reflect a real commitment to missile defense. This is an administration that has delayed on that issue and is not moving as fast as we think we should. In the Bush choice of Donald Rumsfeld as U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. got a man whom the Washington Post called a leading proponent not only of national missile defenses, but also of the U.S. efforts to take control of outer space. In 1998, a commission headed by Rumsfeld, most of its members appointed by the House Speaker Newt Gingrich and Senator Majority Leader Trent Lott, both arch-conservatives or arch-greedy I won't say that word, but you know what I'm thinking, reversed a 1995 finding by the National Intelligence Agencies that the country was not in imminent danger from ballistic missiles developed by new powers. The report by the Commission of Assessment, The report by the Commission to assess the ballistic missile threat to the United States, which became known as the Rumsfeld Commission, claims that rogue states pose such a threat that justifying prompt deployment of missile defense. This was how long before they started the Iraq War? Announcing his naming of Rumsfeld as Defense Secretary, Bush declared that he was most impressed by the work of the Rumsfeld Commission. With Rumsfeld, a former defense secretary, back in that position again, we'll have a person who is wise on the subject of missile defense. Bush went on, "We've got a great opportunity in America to redefine how wars are fought and won." Couldn't help but the accent put in, folks. "Our nation is well positioned to use the technologies to redefine the military." Rumsfeld has been described by the avidly pro-Star Wars right-wing Center for Security Policy as a trusted advisor and a financial supporter, and in 1998 was awarded its Keeper of the Flame Award. The Center's advisory board includes such Star Wars promoters as Edward Teller and Lockheed Martin executives such as Bruce Jackson. I believe it. Rats and thieves hang out together, and murderers. Ugh. Says Gagnon of the Bush-Cheney administration, "This so-called election is a major victory for those who intend to put weapons into space at an enormous cost to the U.S. taxpayer and to world stability." He notes statements by Bush during the campaign that the U.S. should deploy and design quantum leap weapons, and that Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories would play a major role in the development of weapons that would allow the U.S. to redefine war on our terms. Both laboratories have been deeply involved in space-based laser work. Democrat Al Gore maintained during the campaign that any defense missile should be limited in scope. Liar! A strong stand against missile defense and Star Wars was taken by Green Party candidate Ralph Nader and Socialist Party candidate David McReynolds. The power structure of the U.S. gathers together at the Council of Foreign Relations, a 3,000-member group that includes among its members those who were considered the top figures in government. Most of the now former leading officials in the Clinton administration, for example, Clinton's predecessor, George Bush, was a member along with many other top aides. Of the new Bush-Cheney administration, Council on Foreign Relations members include Cheney, Rice, and Secretary of State Colin Powell. Stephen J. Hadley is also an extremely active council member. Indeed, in 2000 he gave speeches on missile defense at both the Council's National Conference and National Program meeting. The presentation at the National Program meeting was entitled, "Should the New Administration Deploy a National Missile Defense?" There are members from U.S. banks and corporations, and media too. Indeed, more than a dozen editors and writers from the New York Times alone are council members, along with Diane Sawyer, Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, Jim Lehrer, Barbara Walters, Katharine Graham, chairman of the Washington Post, and several other top editors. The elite council, founded in 1921, says its mission is to serve our nation through study and debate, private and public. In 1998, it issued a report titled Space, Commerce, National Security, written by Air Force Colonel Frank Klotz, described as a military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. In summary, the report declared, the most immediate task of the United States in the years ahead is to sustain and extend its leadership in the increasingly intertwined field of military and commercial space. This requires a robust and continuous presence in space. So we're at a new subtitle. It's called Historical Precedent, and we're on page 63. Another important element of the situation goes way back to before Reagan unveiled Star Wars and concerns how the U.S. space program began. The space program of today has its roots deep in the strategy of world domination through global terror pursued by the Nazis in World War II. Jack Mano, and professor at the State University of New York, environmental scientist and Forestry College, pointed out in his seminal 1984 book, Arming the Heavens, The Hidden Military Agenda for Space, 1945 through 1995. Many of the early Space War schemes were dreamt up by the scientists working for the German military, scientists who brought their rockets and their ideas to America after the war. Arming the Heavens details the development of Nazi Germany during World War II of the V-1 and V-2 rockets, and how at war's end the U.S. sought to grab as many of the German rocket scientists as possible. It was like a professional sports draft, Mano writes, and corporate America was deeply involved. Scientists from the Nazi Peenemünde Rocket Center were turned over for interrogation to Richard Porter, who was in Germany representing the General Electric Corporation, which held the Army contract for the first long-range ballistic missiles under the development in the United States. In the end, the U.S. adopted nearly 1,000 German military scientists, many of whom later rose to positions of power in the U.S. military, NASA, and aerospace industry. Well, no wonder we're off track. We really did get infiltrated by the Nazis. Back to the book, and this is quoting from Arming the Heavens. Quote, Wernher von Braun and his V-2 colleagues began working on rockets for the U.S. Army. They soon launched at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico the world's first two-stage rocket using salvaged V-2 as the first stage and a smaller booster rocket that fired when the first rocket burnt out, Mano relates. Quote, in 1949, with the beginning of the Korean War, the Army ordered von Braun and his rocket team to the Redstone Army Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. They were given the task of producing an intermediate-range ballistic missile to carry battlefield atomic weapons up to 200 miles. The Germans produced a modified V-2 renamed the Redstone. Huntsville began to become a major center of U.S. military space activities, which it continues to be, and soon Von Braun began to emerge as the most dynamic spokesperson for America's budding space program. So we literally have a Nazi representing our space program. Wow. The U.S. military on its Redstone Arsenal website provides this narrative on von Braun. He became technical director of the pertinent Rocket Center in 1937, where the V-2 rocket was developed. Near the end of World War II, he led more than 100 of his own rocket team members to surrender to the Allied powers. Von Braun came to the United States in September 1945 under contract with the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps as part of Operation Paperclip. He worked with high-altitude firings of captured V-2 rockets at White Sands Proving Ground, unquote. And let me read to you this name, pertinent Rocket Center. I think that's how you say it, pertinent Rocket Center. It's PEENEMUENDE. So that was what it was called in Germany. So I had to look up how to say that because I could not say it. So back to this little story of how we got infiltrated by the Nazis. Quite literally. We literally gave them contracts. He worked on high-altitude firings at captured V-2 rockets at White Sands Proving Ground. Von Braun and his group were then sent to the Redstone Arsenal in 1949, where he became Director of Development Operations. After the creation of NASA, Von Braun and his team were transferred to it and became the nucleus of the George C. Marshall Space Flight Center at Redstone Arsenal. For 10 years, Von Braun and his Marshall director, leaving in 1970 to go to NASA headquarters to serve as Deputy Associate Administrator. So how do you like that, folks? I'm like dumbfounded. Quite literally, our Space Force was infiltrated by Nazis. So are we at all shocked right now that we have a Nazi in the White House? I mean, literally, the man is unhinged right now, saying the most despicable, disrespectful things from the position of the White House. But we're shocked when right after World War II, our own government infiltrated the government, our own government with 1,000 scientists. I don't know about you, but that makes me spit nails. Okay, I'm going to get back to this book. Former German Major General Walter Dornberger, who had been in charge of the entire Nazi rocket program, also becoming a powerful figure in the U.S. space program. In 1947, as a consultant to the U.S. Air Force and advisor to the Department of Defense, Walter Dornberger wrote a planning paper for his new employees, relates Mano. He projected a system of hundreds of nuclear-armed satellites, all orbiting at different altitudes and angles, each capable of re-entering the atmosphere on command from Earth to proceed to its target. The Air Force began to work on Dornberger's idea under the acronym NABS, Nuclear Armed Bombardment Satellites. As a variation of NABS, Dornberger also proposed an anti-ballistic missile system in space in the form of hundreds of satellites, each armed with many small missiles. The missiles would be equipped with infrared homing devices and could be launched automatically from orbit. This concept was also taken under study by the Air Force in the 1950s, labeled BAMBI, Ballistic Missile Boost Intercept. It was an idea that would reappear in the space war dreams of the Reagan administration in 1983, unquote. Mano wrote in 1984, quote, "The real tragedy of an arms race in space will not be so much the weapons that evolve. They can hardly be worse than what we already have. But that by extending and accelerating the arms race into the 21st century, the chance will have been lost to move towards a secure and peaceful world." Even if the militarists succeed in arming the heavens and gaining superiority over potential enemies, by the 21st century, the technology of terrorism, chemical, bacteriological, genetic, psychological weapons, and portable nuclear bombs will prolong the anxiety of constant insecurity. Only by eliminating the sources of international tension through cooperation and common development can any kind of national security be achieved in the next century. Space, an intrinsically international environment, could provide the opportunity for the beginnings of such development, unquote. It is now the 21st century, and Manna was saying from his home in Syracuse that in the past as today, control over the earth is what those who want to weaponize space chiefly want. The Nazi scientists are an important historical and technical link, and also an ideological link, he said. As to claims of space warfare being defensive, from how Reagan characterized his Star Wars plan as a shield to the Appalachian missile defense today, it's all a smokescreen. The aim is to put all the pieces together and have the capacity to carry out global warfare, including weapon systems that reside in space, unquote. A new element behind Star Wars is the development of a global economy and what is deemed a need by those promoting it to have control over the process of globalization, unquote. Well, that's the end of that subtitle, folks. We're on a new subtitle called Globalization and Control. I think I'm going to stop here. We're on page 67. We're almost finished with this book. I want to thank you for joining us. I hope you make use of this information because I think it's really vital now in terms of how our Congress is doing things, how they both operate pro-nuclear. And really, let's get clear, it's just about profit. It's all about profit. The whole thing is just about profit. They don't care about human life. Democrat, Republican, they don't really care. People in Flint, Michigan still don't have water. People across the country have tainted water more and more often across. So this is what we're standing up against. That's why I'm reading this book. And I want to thank everybody who joins us every week to listen to my radio program. Hopefully the hours will be up and down. Right now we're on Wednesdays on KEPW here in Eugene, Springfield Hour. You can always listen to my podcast on Spreaker. You can go to my YouTube channel, Nuts for Art, NUTZFORART. Although I will warn you, a lot of my YouTube videos, I have a little bit of a rough language because the nails, I start spitting nails and the cuss words start flying out. So anyways, I don't do that for the radio because it's FCC and all that other stuff. So, but it's infuriating. And part of my goal, when I say put your courage feet on, I don't mean life is horrible. I mean, life has changed. We're in a different stew now. We have a whole different set of rules. We're realizing we're waking up to the idea that we're living in a toxic world. And guess what? You don't have to use your courage when you're not living in fear, when things aren't challenging. But fear is what? False evidence appearing real. So what we have is a bunch of real evidence that has been kept from us. And that's what this book is about. That's what my program is about. It's to help us learn how to defend ourselves from it all. So I hope you guys get encouraged and embrace your life. Happiness is resistance. That's what I mean. We get to enjoy life completely fully now. And we open our hearts up so that we can actually allow the universe to bring us solutions because we certainly need them. So thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Lonnie Clark. I'm finishing up this reading, Weapons in Space, and we'll talk to you guys soon. As I say on my YouTube channel, put your courage feet on. The Age of Fission radio show brings you book readings, pertinent articles, interviews with both activists and victims of nuclear and environmental contamination. We strive to deliver only the facts from reliable sources. We want to remind you that love is greater than fear, and happiness is resistance. Our dedication to love and happiness paves the road for innovation and healing. As we face our harsh reality, let us hold each other up and rejoice in our humanity. If you want to comment, please send your thoughts to ageoffission@gmail.com. That's AGEOFFISSION @gmail.com to your host, Lonnie Clark. You're listening to KEPW LP 97.3 FM, serving Eugene and Springfield. Also live streaming at www.kepw.org.